All right, so in this video, we're going to take a look at debugging in Odin and how to debug Odin programs, and two different ways of doing that. One of them is primarily terminal based and so on, and we're going to also take a look at how to use VSCode in order to debug. So first of all, I've already mentioned that logging is very useful. If you're doing printf debugging and so on, you can use log debugf and so on. And I would say using that plus debugging in a debugger these are perfectly fine ways of working. I would say in the debate between printf debugging and debugging in a debugger, I'm playing both sides. So anyway, first I want to just show briefly some stuff in my task file, right? So I've added a few aliases or commands. First of all, we have run, depends on build. You have deps here as a key. Depends on build, it runs bin sandbox, etc. Nothing super interesting there. We have build debug, and so importantly, here we use this as a normal build command, Odin build sandbox, and then we out, and I usually just have a separate debug binary, so I name it differently from the standard one. Then we have o none. This may or may not be needed in your Odin version. It doesn't really matter. It's not a deprecated flag or whatever, I don't think. This means optimization none. Then we have dash debug here. This is going to set our program to be running with Odin debug set to true. Then we have an alias for this. We have sources because this is an actual build command. It generates this and so on. Then we have the actual debug task, which is, it depends on build debug. It's going to run gdb, and so that's the GNU debugger, something or other. And it has an alias. And method none here is, again, like our test one, we always want to run this. It shouldn't check any files to see if they're up to date or anything. If we run debug, we run debug, and so on. The build command, of course, is different. It checks the files to see if they're up to date and so on. So how does this look when we actually run? First of all, when we run build debug like this, right, we can see that, oh, seemingly nothing happened or whatever. No, not really. If we do verbose here, we can see it's up to date in that case here. We can force and so on. If we run task debug, we're gonna build debug and then debug the binary, right? So here we're gonna enter GDB. If I just say run here, we're gonna see here, okay, it ran. There's something interesting though going on here. So if we go to our sandbox Odin here, we can see that we're reading config.json. What is in config.json? It's this, right? Interval is 42. So now we might consider, okay, why am I then seeing interval nil here? That is suspicious, right? So let's look at our program and see if we can find out what's going on. We have this read configuration here and so on. Everything seems fine here. Curious, right? Now, if we were to put a breakpoint, we say break, and here we can tab complete stuff. So sandbox dot read configuration like this. We run again. We're going to enable the TUI enable. That's just for me to see more easily where we are. So yeah, here we're going to read a file, and that works fine, right? Here we have parse configuration, and of course this is the value that we're saying that this is not actually being filled in, right? There's something going on in there. So if we say S to step in, we can see kind of what's happening. So we're reading an object, right? And we can see this object is true. We can then see the object itself here. And this is interesting, right? Let's actually, just to visualize this a bit more clearly, I'm going to quit here and we're going to actually use this hybrid situation that I was talking about before. We're going to say log debugf object here. And we're going to put a breakpoint now in sandbox.parse configuration that we're going to run, and to enable. And when I run this here, you can see this is an empty map. And that is very curious, right? This means that any check we're doing after this point, it really kind of doesn't matter, right? We're never going to find the interval key and so on. And now you might be wondering, why would this be? Well, in this particular case, it's actually a bug in the standard library, believe it or not. Or at least what I would characterize as a bug in the standard library. What's actually happening here, and I've been debugging this. This is how I reached this conclusion, testing things and so on. We are never going to find this here, right? Because we have an object that is an empty map. But if we were to say sandbox Odin here, we increase this. We say, for example, 8192, like this. Doesn't matter so much. The idea is that we have enough space. Now we run task debug again, and we break sandbox parse configuration. We run. Suddenly, we see that we have our interval. And this is, there was nothing indicating here that we had any kind of allocation issue, right? Of course, in our code here, if we go to this, what we actually should be seeing is some kind of allocation error when something is parsed. Here, right? But if we, let's indulge here a little bit and jump in. Of course, I did not need to exit there, but let's break on sandbox parse again, run. We're going to enable here, and we're going to actually step into JSON parse, right? And here, we can see that it takes our context allocator, right? And that is, of course, what we wanted from the beginning or whatever. Like, that makes perfect sense. But at no point does this actually say, there's an error here, right? So this is supposed to be able to return an error. And we can look more specifically at what that means. Make parser from string. Here, to be honest, it doesn't necessarily matter so much where we go here. We're going to see that there's really nothing that seems to necessarily look at this properly. here we've returned from this. And curiously also, the standard is actually set to JSON 5 by default, but that's because JSON 5 is a superset of JSON. So any JSON is parsable as JSON 5 and so on. If we go in here, we're going to see that, yeah, we're not getting much here, right? And so this is something where JSON parse actually has this issue, and JSON unmarshal does not. JSON unmarshal will tell us, hey, you've run out of memory. And so there's really not that much I can tell you about JSON parse here to fix this or whatever. I guess I'm gonna look into it and maybe make a PR instead. But this is, I hope this has been somewhat of an illustration of how to debug things in Odin and how to sort of step around and so on. We can see that we can figure out logic and so on. Now, briefly, we're not gonna go over all of this stuff, of course, in Visual Studio Code. Excuse this standard kind of font and so on. Let's just make stuff bigger, I suppose. Control. How do you? It's been a while since I used this. No, hang on. JSON. Oh, no. Let's say 24. I have no idea. It doesn't matter so much, maybe. So there are a few things that go into this. You are going to want native debug, of course, Odin language support, and you are going to want this native debug, or well, you can probably do this with several different extensions and so on, but this one I would argue kind of works. It works well. We're not going to go over the build step here, only the actual debug step, and these are different on VS Code. So, you know, keep that in mind. But if we do want to do this here, we're going to say debug add configuration like this. We're going to choose GDB, and then we can say this sandbox debug here, for example, request launch, and so on. Not much that goes into this particular configuration here. You can have arguments and so on, of course. This is something you can, you know, explore on your own. Arguments like this, auto run debugger args, etc., etc., etc. So let's save that. And now if I press F5, we should be seeing that this actually, let's say sidebar. Yeah. Zen mode. No, this is not the one we want. So F5. And of course here, we have a breakpoint in read configuration here. This is because I was testing stuff out before. And here it's mostly straightforward. Of course, you have different bindings. You have step over F10, step in F11, etc. If you're using the default settings. Not much, you know, to talk about here really. We can mouse over things here and see values instead, right? We have locals here, but you'll note that it can be hard to kind of see the information at a glance like this. Data URL len2. Len2, I don't know. Hang on. len2. No. Yeah, the length for this is also a little bit broken. This might be incomplete debug information. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. But let's continue. So if we wanted to, hit the same thing we did before, we would F11 in here. And here we could F10, F11, F11. We're hitting this here. Parsing an object. Actually, let's set a watch here for err. Let's just do object.len here, maybe. Now, let's actually go back to our previous configuration. We had 256 here. And try to... here I'm actually going to build this, by the way, in here. Build, debug. Because of course we don't have the build instruction in VS Code, so it's gonna be better if we do it like this. We launch and oppa, that was GPB bindings. So let's step into here, step into our parse. And we're going to be parsing an object, of course. We expect a token, we parse an object body. And so here, at some point, right, one of these should fail, right? And we're getting deep into JSON parsing here. Our locals here are, so here we're actually doing something for every character. IN, T, V, etc. L. We should be finishing with this now. And here we're cloning the string now, right? So we need 8 bytes. we're passing this. We're parsing a colon. Now we're going to parse the value. And of course, here we might run into problems. Let's see if we can add the context allocator here. Actually, we can see the context allocator up here. I want to, yeah. We can't actually see any of the interesting information in our context allocator, but yeah. Let's see here. This is a float here only because we're not parsing integers, by the way. We have to parse integers equal true here. Not a big deal, really. We can see here that everything is perfectly fine at this point. It parsed 42. So what is obj here? Obj has no data. Right, so we've already run into the problem here, I suppose. No, we're actually fine. That's if we already had an object key, right? That makes perfect sense, okay. This should fail an allocation. Maybe. I don't know. Did it? Is the question, right? We can see nothing has changed up here. There's zero data in obj. And that is presumably where the actual issue lies, right? Obj here should actually let's go further and see, right? Yeah, to everything here, this looks perfectly legit. Except our JSON value is nothing, in fact, right? The object is just empty, right? So when we don't have enough memory, the key here, the key difference is that line in parser Odin here. If we go into parse object body, this line here, let's breakpoint there, right? And see, you know, is that the case, right? So let's change. I'm gonna save that. We're gonna change this again and see, is that where we have diverging behavior, right? Task build debug and F5. And here we can continue until we hit this line. I think it's fine. F10. And here we can see we have an obj with a len of 1. So obj key lm here is really the culprit, right? And now we've used a debugger productively here to actually find an issue, right? And of course, we're deep in the standard library here. No amount of printf debugging on our side would have helped us with this. So I'm gonna go and fix this bug now in the standard library. But I hope this was helpful. to at least some degree. And I hope it showed sort of how we can do this, and how you could actually, if you wanted to, you could just use VS Code as your debugger and it will be fine. It works. You can see here that it tells us at least some information and so on. It can be fairly easy to visualize things when you're doing it like this. But yeah, again, I hope that was helpful. If you like the video, yeah, like and subscribe, I suppose. Have a nice day and ciao.